We give him one. Would you please welcome A Barron, Tom Barron. So Tom, this mic's live, all for you. Have a seat, there's a bottle of water there too.
Thank you, Ken.
So Tom, it's absolutely terrific to have you here. Students can and will be asking questions. I've told you already, but I'll repeat it. And also for the benefit of people, if you see me playing with my phone, I am not checking, or watching TikToks. I am actually checking the Canvas Q&A for you to put things in. So Tom, let me start by asking you how you got interested in writing. And I'll kind of give a little background for people. Undergraduate at Princeton, then you went ahead and be a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. You got a law degree at Harvard, a business degree, an MBA at Harvard, and ultimately started writing books for young adults. How did that happen?
Look, first of all, Ken, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm really happy to be here with all of you who care about our planet and the environment and nature, and also about the stories we tell. We're going to talk about that because I do believe, and it's the ultimate answer to your question, that the stories we tell are the most important way we can convey environmental values and ethics, and actually change consciousness. We'll get there. But to answer your question, my particular life has had a rather random, bizarre journey. And yes, I grew up on a ranch in Colorado. I went to college, had good fortune to study abroad after that. And during that time, I had this growing dream about being a writer. And this vision of what it would be like to be back home at a cabin in Colorado writing books. And so I actually wrote my first novel during the year I took off to just travel. I had never been able to travel out of the United States before, and so I used that opportunity being in Europe to do that. And somewhere along the line, between the Trans-Siberian Railway and working as an apprentice roof thatcher in Japan, I ended up writing my first novel. And I sent it off to every publisher I could think of. I literally just mailed it off. And in those days, you didn't just push a send button. You actually mailed a physical box to people. Well, I guess you could say it had a terrific reception. That book was sent around to 32 publishers, and in the course of a couple months, I got 32 rejections. So it was a unanimous verdict. So at that point, I needed to think about a plan B because there was clearly something not happening in that writing dream. So yes, so I went to law school. I did a bunch of other things. I did get involved with a company that starts up other firms and actually in particular had an environmental focus, did some work there. I ended up, for unexplainable reasons, I ended up as president of that company and things were going really well. But here's the trick. The company was in New York City, and I was getting up every morning at 4:30 or 5 in the morning just to sit at the little tiny kitchen counter of my New York City apartment to write for an hour and a half. And I loved it. I'd write about what it was like to go walk in Central Park at dawn, or I'd write about the character sketches on the crazy, bizarre people who were coming to see me and pitch a better solar energy device or a new water-saving device or whatever it was. And ultimately, I realized, as busy as I was with the day job, that was the heartbeat of my day, the real living heartbeat, and there was something wrong with that picture. One last thing. How many of you here have a sense of your own mortality? How many of you feel like it's something you're aware of and think of now and then, not all the time, but that you're a fragile and brief being who has a life, and it's an opportunity to take seriously, right? That's a lot of you. Well, I had that feeling and have always had that. And so if you have that kind of a disconnect between the life you're leading and your core values, you have to take it seriously. So I had the fun of walking in and shocking all my business partners one day and saying, oh, you know, the numbers look great, the trends are good, you guys are gonna make a whole lot of money, but I quit. And literally said that. And it was delicious to feel the total silence in the room as I did that. People really did think I was nuts. Ken, I mean, I think I've told you this story. The leading investor in our company came up to me with a beat up business card, and he put it in my hand, and he said, Tom, this is my therapist. You gotta call him right now because you've lost it. Anyway, and I said, no, actually I haven't. This is a dream I've always had, and I can't let those 32 rejection letters defeat me. I've got to try this one more time. So the quick summary is that was about 25 years ago and 32 books ago. And we moved out to Colorado, and that's where I've been telling stories since then.
And postscript to that, selling millions and millions of books in the process, which is astonishing.
It is true, especially astonishing given the rocky start I had. But it's also, let me just add, Ken, it's incredibly humbling. Every time I look at the bookshelf that has my international editions, there's almost 30 different languages of my books and all of that good stuff happening. I feel just so lucky to be part of this wonderful human longing to share and tell stories. And I know that all of those millions of copies, they really aren't about me. They're not even about wonderful characters like young Merlin or Kate, who has great adventures in her environmental quests. It's not. It's about the power of stories to touch people of all languages, cultures, religions, backgrounds, everywhere in the world, across time too, when you think about it. And that's why you cut your teeth writing about Milton. It doesn't matter how many centuries have gone by or thousands of years. If it's a really good story, it lands, and it still lands. So it's a wonderful and humbling thing to be part of that world.
So Tom, I want to ask a little more about the books themselves, because when we first met, a dozen years ago, maybe, I knew I was going to meet you, so I should kind of read what you do. And I remember reading that book, the first, The Lost Years of Merlin, and seeing, to my surprise, in it, a story that was taken from John Muir, from the mountains of California. And if you don't know this, and you probably don't otherwise, because most people don't read John Muir nowadays, unfortunately, but there's this amazing scene where he climbs as tall a tree as he possibly can in the middle of a thunderstorm, where there's lightning everywhere, and it's an incredibly frightening experience. But this is John Muir wanting to experience the full of nature, what we call the sublime. So it's this all-inspiring and in one sense horrifying, and you're drawn to it. It's almost a religious experience. And there it was in the Merlin books. And I thought, isn't that a clever idea? Because most people aren't going to read John Muir, especially as young adults, and yet you put that experience, you sort of repackaged that experience and gave it to them. You want to talk about doing that? Because you do that often, I think.
Yeah, well, honestly, I have the good fortune of having gotten my start in writing as a nature writer. And if you think about it, what's the job of a nature writer? It's not just to describe a walk someplace. It's to actually bring a place to life. I mean, literally to make your readers feel all of their senses coming alive, wherever you are. By the way, Ken, I feel the same thing about fantasy worlds, which I write a fair amount about, imaginary worlds. Those worlds, it's even more important that they have to come to life. I view the places in my stories, because of that nature writing experience, as really not just a backdrop, not just the setting, but as another character in the stories. They have moods, they have histories, they have personalities, and all of your senses need to be alive. And if I've done my job right, you actually feel like you're on the magical island of Finkyra with Merlin. Or you actually feel like you've traveled back in time through a great redwood tree that's also a time tunnel in one of the Kate adventures called the Ancient One, or any of my other books. But I feel like the place has to vault forward as a character. So coming back to your question, absolutely. I from my own experience, climbing trees or being out in nature, in wilderness, when a sudden storm or a really dramatic cold spell hit and struck, and snow suddenly fell on me, or lightning strikes a tree right nearby and it explodes, or climbing up into a really difficult place to get up to and also down from, I've found. But those places are so alive, it's so electric. I wanted young Merlin to have a moment like that, and I realized what he needs to do is what John Muir did in the mountains of California, and climb up a tree and suddenly endure this powerful, amazing storm, almost get killed because of the violence of it, and then as the storm dissipates and mist is rising from every glade all around him in the forest, to have that sense of renewal and transformation that nature can provide. Because what young Merlin needed in that moment of the story was to suddenly become aware of his own power inside himself. Nothing magical about this. It's a power we all have. His own power to transform from a really difficult, struggle-filled, squalid even life into something more, something higher. And that storm was the vehicle in storytelling to convey that transformation that's in nature. And he needed to wake up to realize it was also in him.
I think you might have started the trend, because as you may know, in the overstory, Richard Powers has two climate activists way up in a redwood tree in the mountains of California, that's a part, where they experience the same sort of thing. So.
Well, actually, Richard Powers needed no inspiration from me. He told a brilliant story there. But I will say, he and I share that the deep inspiration there comes from trees themselves, and the immensity and power and distinctiveness from humanity that trees are. When you think about it, we humanity, we wander, we move, we're here, we're gone, we're often on our phones, our devices, we're distracted, we're moving, we're thinking about tomorrow or next 5 years. A tree, if you can channel the deep personality of a tree, think about it for a moment. If you have a favorite tree, think about that tree, whatever it is, an apple tree, one of the beautiful ficus trees on this campus, a redwood, whatever it is. What would that tree's voice sound like? What would that tree have to share with us? What would that tree want humanity to understand? And then think about it further and imagine that tree has been standing in one place for decades, centuries, maybe even thousands of years in the case of an ancient bristlecone pine or a great redwood tree. And that requires sinking your roots deeply in one place, just making a presence right here, deep roots, and your boughs, your branches reaching up to the sky. You have to be so fully integrated and at peace and present with yourself to be a great tree. And so that's the ticket. I think that's why I continually go to nature for inspiration, because of examples like that. But we need to go there too if we're going to defend and protect the earth that nurtures and supports us all and all forms of life. We have to be able to imagine that. Think about that story perhaps the next time you see a tree that you love. Maybe you'll hear its voice.
So many questions come to mind, but I should note, by the way, I already have questions popping up from students, but I have a couple of mine, or a comment to make.
Keep going.
A friend of mine...
You're asking great questions. By the way, you should think about a career as a teacher. Don't you think he'd be pretty good at it?
Thanks. Tell that to my partner. She'll be happy.
Yeah.
Probably will love it. So you actually, I would say, are in a long line of environmentalists, because a friend of mine actually is a Henry David Thoreau scholar, argued that Thoreau was one of the first people to ever have nature appear as a character in the work. So if you read Walden, at one point, and you have read parts of Walden for my 2 other classes, at one point Thoreau says, Walden, is that you? And he starts addressing it like a character, talking like a character. So I think that's interesting, and it leads to my next question, because I think of myself as a teacher, but as a scholar activist. So I am a teacher, I'm a scholar, sure, it's a big part of what I do, but I do think of what I do, it has to be an activist too. I think of you as an activist, Tom. Do you think of yourself as an activist?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I think of myself as, first, a storyteller. Actually, frankly, I'll back up. I think of myself first as a dad and a husband. That's the innermost circle of what I do in the world, and it gives me great joy and gratitude to be able to be a dad of wonderful kids and a husband to my wonderful wife. I also get to be a storyteller, and that's the next circle out. And then the next circle out is an activist for the planet. And I will say this, Ken, that more and more with time, I am spending a lot of time helping NGOs in the environment, a lot of different organizations, through various different, who have various different job descriptions themselves. Some are focused on protecting wildlife and biodiversity. Others are focused on protecting public lands, wilderness areas, wildlife refuges. Others are focused on environmental education. And the place that actually calls to me most is that third place, is giving young people a sense of how wondrous and amazing and inspirational and also healing and truly transformative the world of nature is. And if we are open to that and fall in love with that again, or for the first time, then we can speak with great passion about why it's really important to save ourselves, our fellow creatures, our places that we care about. All people depend on that. All creatures depend on that. All life on this really beautiful but beleaguered planet of ours depend on that.
That actually raises a question, Tom. So we have an environmental studies program here, one of the oldest, largest, and I would argue most respected in the country. We always just call it ES. And so many people think that stands for environmental science program, but it is environmental studies. And for a long, long time, you've been interested in the environmental humanities. Before most of us knew quite what that was, and we were trying to figure it out. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because it is such a different approach, and maybe people in my classes don't see it as different because that's all I preach too. But what are the environmental humanities to you, and what's the importance there?
Great question. Look, I'll say this very, very bluntly. I think one of the greatest powers that exists is the power of stories. When you think about it for a moment. In all cultures, in all places around the world, throughout history, peoples have told stories to give life to their biggest ideas, to pose answers to their most deeply held questions. If you're gonna ask questions like, is there an afterlife? Or what does my life mean? Or can one person actually matter? Or how am I connected to the wide universe? Questions like that. If you're gonna ask questions like that, what better way to do that than through telling stories? We've all heard lectures on that or seen reams of scientific studies on that. And all of those are important. Those are valuable, but not nearly as powerful as telling a really compelling story that touches people's hearts about those questions. So I'll even go further. If you're gonna enter into this realm of trying to protect the earth, the environment, our planet, ourselves, our fellow creatures, if you're thinking about climate change, if you're thinking about the clean air and drinkable water that we need, if you're thinking about good soil to raise plants and trees, if you're thinking about open space for people to feel truly connected with the natural world, all of those things, telling stories is your most effective tool. I'm not saying it's instead of hard work, activism, really doing everything you can to help causes that actually on the ground make a difference. You've got to do that too, but never forget the power of stories. One quick example that might surprise you. Think about the story of Noah's Ark. How many here have heard that story of Noah's Ark? Pretty much everybody, right? It's one of the Bible's most cherished and powerful stories. And it's still very much alive here in the 21st century, all around the world, not just in countries where Christianity or Judaism are dominant. It's around the world. Noah's Ark has a particular landing place in the human psyche. And I've always thought, yes, that is a story about faith and devotion and the rest. When you think about what God asks Noah to do, to build a ship in the middle of the desert before there's any sign of rain and assemble two of every kind of creature on earth as a metaphor. What a powerful environmental story that is. When you think about it, we're on an ark right here. It's called planet Earth. And if God asked Noah to go through all of that trouble simply to save two of every kind of creature, I ask you, how can we do anything less ourselves than that? That's a story. That's a metaphor. And I promise you, because I've shared that metaphor with lots of people who don't agree with me about environmental activism, but when they hear that story, I've seen it. I've seen it change people's minds and attitudes. But I had to go there by a story even that they knew in a different context. Stories have really great power. So if you don't remember anything else about this A Barron guy who came here to talk with you today, please remember this. Stories have immense power, and the stories we tell can save the earth. So be thoughtful, be mindful about what stories you tell and what ideas they convey. Please avoid the allure of being preachy and teachy because that's an immediate turnoff to people. I had to learn that lesson too. I learned that you're much more powerful if you're somewhat indirect in your storytelling. That's something, Ken, you know well.
Thanks. I have a little bit of housekeeping to do. I have to take roll. So I'm going to do that now. So everyone taking clicker roll. And then I want to comment on that, Tom, because I thought it was so interesting. So how it works, Tom, everybody has a little device on an app on their phone. And now we're taking roll. It's interesting, the Noah thing, because there really is a sea change in storytelling in the 17th century. And you have someone like Andrew Marvell writing in the middle of it, writing upon Appleton House, and he talks about wilderness being a green and ever-growing arc. That's his thing. And he translates it and says, if you want to start thinking about arcs, start thinking about wilderness in those terms. So, we're kind of halfway, and even though I want to keep asking you questions, I'd be remiss not to ask questions from students. And let me pull up the first.
Oh, this is the best part. I look forward to that.
Well, we're going to see who can put Tom on the spot. Hold on a second.
Before you choose a question, can I just ask, I hope that the things I've been saying make sense. Do they ring true for many of you? Stories really are essential to being alive and human, but they're also wonderfully potent tools, especially in service of something big and valuable that we care about, like this planet.
Yeah, terrific. And actually, I'm having a technical problem, but I remember the first question. How important do you think education is in like K through 12? Climate education for children. Should that actually be required? And as you may know, I've been working years trying to get it to be a requirement of the UC and at UCSB, and still not a requirement, so these lectures are my best shot at educating as many people. But should it be required, K through 12, climate/environmental education?
Let me ask you a question. Do you think honesty and courage and grace and civility and curiosity and love are important to convey to young people?
Well,
I know your answer. I know your answer, Ken, and the answer is profoundly yes. That is my answer to environmental studies. Yes, but I will say it doesn't have to be a dedicated course. It could be that you infuse every other subject with environmental issues and questions. So if you're talking about philosophy, you got to talk about the philosophy of how do we live on Earth in a sustainable, peaceful way that is inclusive of ourselves and our fellow creatures. Let's not forget our non-human friends on this planet, whether they have voices like the meadowlark songbird or whether they are silent most of the time, like that great tree you love, they're here too. So I think I view environmental awareness and commitment as not a separate subject. It's not a climate class. By the way, nor is climate the only way to slice the environmental universe. It's a hugely important way, but it's not the only one. And so I feel like you have to go deeper and just find ways to weave it into the curriculum in every subject: math, science, literature, performing arts, religion, philosophy. Everything has an environmental aspect. Everything. So that's the way I think about that.
I am going to the podium to see if I can access the Q&A.
Okay.
Because I can't do it on my phone, but I have it up here. I should be able to get it up in a minute.
No worries.
And Tom, let me ask you another question, one of my questions. Could you talk about Magic in Mountains podcast? Because that sounds like another literary reference, by the way. Thomas Mann wrote this book, one of the greatest books of the first half of the 20th, Magic Mountain. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing with that recently.
I decided after a long time of thinking about it that maybe to do a podcast a few years ago. But I resisted it for a long time too, because honestly, there were so many and are so many great podcasts out there. One of my daughter's favorites is a podcast about pasta, and it's actually called Mission Impossible. I don't know if any of you know that podcast, but it's hilarious and fun, and has some great recipes if you like pasta. But my point is, before I put something out there in whatever form, whether it's in a book or a movie or a documentary film or an essay, I want to make sure that it's saying something unique and fresh and maybe even inspiring. So I want it to be out there, but with a purpose. I don't just need another thing out there. And so for a long time, I resisted podcasts. And then, heck, what do I know about pasta? But I finally realized in time that the best podcasts are storytelling. They're a different kind of storytelling. And that really got me interested. So they're a different kind of story, just like writing a ballad is a different kind of poetry than writing a haiku poem, or writing a Homerian epic poem, or all of the different ways there are to tell stories or communicate ideas in every genre. And I realized, this is just like there are novels, there are big fat trilogies like I like to write, there are children's books, there are huge, big nonfiction treatises, and there are campfire tales, and Broadway theater, and off-Broadway, and off-Broadway. And all of these are different kinds of storytelling. Movies, good television, documentary films, these are stories. And maybe I could add a little bit of something positive. We'll see with time how it works out. So I've done now 2 seasons, and I mix it up between what I love most, honestly. Part of it is I interview really wonderful, committed environmentalists. Like the first interview of this past season was Jane Goodall. And then I've interviewed Carter Roberts, who's the CEO of the World Wildlife Fund. And I've interviewed Kate Williams, who runs an amazing organization in Vermont called 1% for the Planet. I've interviewed people who are into protecting rivers and mountains and city parks and ocean and air and climate, of course. All of those folks have their chance to, and I really probe what really do they care about the most. And we've had some marvelous, inspiring conversations. Another basket is I interview great writers. And so you're at risk, Ken, of being interviewed at some point. I write about, I actually have interviewed wonderful writers like Isabel Allende on my last season, and others. I've also done podcast episodes that are just really me telling stories, always with a point. Like why has the wizard Merlin lasted over now almost 1,500 years as a subject of stories worldwide? Why is that? In short, if you really want to find the answer, go to my website and you'll see in the top of the articles page, you'll see an article I wrote called The Metaphor of Merlin. And it's really about those qualities. There's 3 in particular. One is Merlin always, even in the earliest Celtic lore tales, he stood for universality of all people, all backgrounds, all kinds. He was the only character in all of the Arthurian lore who could talk to the beggar on the street, or the Archbishop of Canterbury, or the nobleman in King Arthur's court, whoever they were, or the witch who had been driven out of her home because men were afraid of her power and wisdom. All of these are characters that Merlin could talk with, and the ancient wolf on the side of the hill, or the hawk soaring overhead, or even the trees and the rivers. He understood every one of us living creatures has a voice, and he could hear it. The second is his love of nature. And nature really was, for Merlin, as it is for me, the place where he goes when his heart is broken, when he feels the most lost or confused. Nature is that place that has that power of healing and inspiration. As I said, that's part of why I've identified with Merlin, because he, like me, has always felt renewed by nature. And then the third and final way is that Merlin, in all of those early stories, wasn't a perfect hero. He was far from it. He had all kinds of dark sides and vulnerabilities and weaknesses, just like all of us, just like me. But he also had the ability to reach for the stars and to see the possibilities in humanity and to help teach a young king and many others to rise and think about living lives based on justice and courage and compassion. So that's just one example.
So we are not to be surprised, having technical problems. If you put your question in Q&A for lecture number 4, I'm having trouble accessing that. So if you do me a big favor and retype it into the Q&A for lecture number 5, that would be the first one for next week, but it's no problem. I have that here and I can look at it. But I do remember some of the questions before I lost access to it. But again, Q&A for lecture number 5. And one of them is, Tom, what are your big writers, big influences, writers? And in a way, maybe the question is, what writers would you recommend for us?
Mm-hmm. There are so many, but I'll suggest a few. In the basket of nature writers, I would totally go to some of the names that have been tossed out here. John Muir, Henry David Thoreau. Rachel Carson is one I particularly love because she understood that you have to convey a love of nature before you can teach about it and the science of it, let alone build on that good, smart policies to protect it. You have to start with the love. And in a book she wrote called A Sense of Wonder, that's the theme of it. There are so many others. I'm not going to dwell on that basket, but in the realm of fiction, I've always loved the writings of many people whose names you'll recognize in the fantasy realm, like J.R.R. Tolkien or Madeleine L'Engle, and so many others. I also think I feel so grateful to have read some beautiful poetry in my life. Poets are marvelous in terms of conveying. Remember what I was saying about the most powerful way to tell a story is not head on directly like a lecture or a sermon. It's indirectly, in the way that I told that Noah's Ark story. It's a story about a man building a boat, for heaven's sakes, and an impossible job. But it's really an environmental parable. In that same way, a good poem really goes deep, and you'll enjoy this, Ken. I remember an interview I watched with Archibald MacLeish, the wonderful poet, when he was in his 80s. He was actually filmed while he was out in his garden, and he was planting some vegetables for the spring, and the interviewer asked him, really, truly, what's the difference between prose and poetry? And he put down his spade and he said, it's like this. If you write a prose description of eating an apple, You talk about, first of all, the color of the apple, how much it weighs in your hand, what it looks like, and then you talk about the flavor. You take a bite, you talk about the flavor, you have all of that detail about an apple, and it's true. And it takes 10 pages to do that. Or you could write a poem like Archibald MacLeish could do, like Mary Oliver could do, like the great romantic poets like Wordsworth and Keats could do. Instead you write half a page. And what it is essentially saying, this is your apple, and here it is, all at once, in your mouth. Swallow it. Everything comes all at once. And it's a much more powerful, condensed, direct, and at the same time, indirect way of conveying the totality of an apple without the details. Just enough to give people the feeling that they can hear that crunch when they bite into it. They can taste that snap of a tart and sweet flavor. They feel the heft of that apple in their hand without your having to detail it. That's what good poetry does.
Excellent. So thanks to everyone putting your things back into Q&A number 5. Our technical problems are over. I now have a phone full of questions for you, Tom. So I'm going to try to consolidate some of these. So someone asked very directly, how do you become a good storyteller? And someone kind of wants that fleshed out a little. What are the most important elements for constructing a moving story, especially when it aims to shift someone's opinions?
Great questions. I'm going to answer that merged question, but first let me say there's no one answer, okay? There are lots of answers. There are lots of ways to tell effective stories. And I look around this room with all of you bright minds and caring hearts, and I feel like there's going to be some new forms of storytelling that you guys will invent, okay? And I'm thrilled about that. So I can only tell you what I've learned. What works for me is I need to have 3 things to tell a really compelling story. And if I don't have all 3, it's not going to work. Number 1 is I need a character I really, really care about. A lead character, she, he, they, it, whatever that character is, I need to really feel I care about the well-being of that character. And that character is almost always in trouble, lost, and in danger when my stories begin, because I find that's a great way to go right down to the core of who that character is, their qualities of courage or hope or perseverance or love. The best way to do that is strip them of all the norms, or at least quickly do that. That's why I have on the first page of young Merlin's adventures, which there are now 13, believe it or not, in that Merlin saga. On the first page of book 1, though you don't have this great exalted wizard or a boy who might someday become that. You have a half-drowned, barely alive kid who washes ashore on this harsh coastline and is thrown out by the sea on the rocks, hits his head, seagulls are swirling, and he's so weak and so full of seawater, he barfs and he barely crawls higher up onto the shore before the ocean waves can grab his torn tunic and pull him back down and drown him. That's where his story begins. Oh, and by the way, it gets worse. Because when he finally has the strength to sit up, he realizes he's lost all of his memory. He has no idea who he is. He doesn't know where he came from. He doesn't know if he took Ken Hiltner's class at UCSB. He doesn't know who his parents were, where he grew up, anything about himself. So he's a total blank slate. That's where the story begins. So if you walked up to that boy, if I had this microphone and said, hey, young fella, do you know that you're going to become the greatest, most exalted, most celebrated wizard of all times? That 1,500 years from now, people will be telling you your stories? What do you think of that? He would say, no possible way on any universe. Well, but that is what happens eventually. The point is, you have to have a character I care about. And the same is true with young Kate, who goes back in time in The Ancient One, or has a voyage to the stars in Heartlight. Any of my characters, Anna in Tree Girl, Promi in my trilogy about the creation of Atlantis, not the destruction of Atlantis, the creation story of Atlantis. All of those things have a core character, and I need to care about that person so that you will care about that person. That's number one. Number two is I need to have a place in that story I really want to voyage to. I really want to bring it to life, and I really want to go back there and invite you to do the same. So whether it's a real place like the redwood forests of Northern California, or an imaginary place like Merlin's magical lost island of Finkyra that's on the edge between the mortal world and the spirit realm, I need to bring that place to life. I really need to understand that place so that bright, caring readers can also know that place. Make it a destination resort for their imaginations. That's the second. And the third thing I have to have is a big moral idea. And this is where that question about how do you address things like the environment or big issues you really care about, that's where that comes in. You have to know what your idea is and think about how you're going to convey that. If I want to convey the power and beauty and immensity and wonder and depth of wisdom of a great redwood tree, I don't write a botanical scientific text about it. The way I do it is to have a young girl who's in trouble and seeking a way to save her town that's at risk and everyone she cares about. Enter into a forest and discover accidentally a tree that's also a time tunnel that whisks her back in time, and they have this great adventure. She barely survives, but she does learn what she needs to know. And then when she's coming forward in time, by the way, there are some people who have followed her into that grove, loggers who want to cut down all the redwoods, and she has to get back in time before the great tree, the ancient one, is cut and falls down, because that would also cut the timeline, and she would be lost forever and never get home to her town and the people she loves. That's a quick and dirty summary of the Ancient One plot, but I think you can tell what I'm really getting across there is the character, personality, and reasons to save that redwood tree and all great trees. But I never hit it on directly. It's always about making the reader care about the character and the place and ultimately the big idea. Got to have all three.
Next question actually kind of talks about that idea of caring. It's a good question. How can we tell compelling stories to the people who hold the earth in their hands? How do we use storytelling to get politicians, presidents of monopoly corporations, and other powerful people to take the climate change movement seriously?
Oh, I love that question. It's a question, honestly, I wake up every single day asking that question. And that's why I play in those realms of working to help NGOs, of trying to support good people who are willing to put themselves through the maelstrom of our current political system in order to try and affect good policy. And honestly, to do my best to tell a good story or two that has those underlying ideas. So that's a really important question, and I guess with your permission, I'm going to take that question and vault it slightly higher to a bigger issue, which is, why are we here? Really, why are we here? I would venture that one big part of why we are all here, and each of us has to decide for ourselves the answer to that question. There's no one answer. But a part of it is to sing the songs of the earth, our deepest needs and longings as humanity, our fellow creatures, animals, plants, trees, and the inanimate, living, breathing elements of nature that are all around us, the air, the water, the soil, the stars. All of this that we are given to experience, I feel like a big part of why we are here as humanity is to help protect and nourish all of those creatures. And the best way to do that is to tell really, really good stories. Not just the ones we write, but in the spirit of why are we here, to tell a story with our lives. Now that may sound a little bit over the top, but I really thoroughly believe it. Hear me out. What I really mean is that each of us in our lives has an opportunity to be what we can be, to live mindfully, to live lovingly, and to live purposefully. How are we going to do that? That's totally up to each one of us. But why are we here? Honestly, a lot of that comes down to seeing our lives as a story. Every single person in this room has a story. You are living with your life. I'm living a story. Ken Heltner is living a story. Everyone you know in your life is living a story, and we live it by the choices that we make. That amounts to our story, the choices we make. And so let's be mindful of those choices. I guess I'll say one more thing on this, and then I'll be quiet. I really want to say this. All we have in our lives is our time and our souls. So why not make the most of both of those, right? Whatever amount of time we have, let's put it to things we truly love, care about, that could matter a lot. And our souls will grow and deepen because of that. So that's my highest hope for all of you wonderful people, is to see your life as a story that you and nobody else gets to write. Make it a really good one.
Actually, there's more on storytelling, but someone asked if they can actually ask Tom something in person after class. The answer to that is yes. Tom and I are going to walk over to South Hall for the honors section, so if you want to walk with us, you can ask questions then. The next one's more about storytelling. You mentioned how storytelling is one of the most effective ways to communicate environmentalism. Sometimes I think environmental researchers take a super pedantic approach to communicating the climate crisis. Do you also feel that way, and why do you think constructing an entertaining story is the best way to reach a larger audience? In other words, why not just give them facts? Why not just tell them what's happening? Why not talk about the millimeters of sea level rise?
That's a great question, and the answer is because we human beings are first and foremost emotional creatures. We have these great, wonderful, powerful minds, but where we begin is our emotional animal selves. So to reach people really, truly, it's most important to touch their hearts, to convey a sense of why they should care about the environment, about and not to lecture, and certainly in this highly politicized era that we happen to be unfortunate enough to be living in, you have to go out of the pedantic yelling back and forth. You have to reach people sideways, and the best way to do that is to tell a good story. So instead of hammering on people that we have to protect biodiversity, and here's the extent of the extinction rates, and here are all the species in parts of the world that are collapsing, some of which you can easily document, and all of which is true. Instead of doing that, tell the story of Noah's Ark or something else, protecting creatures from a different angle. That's where storytelling comes in. It's such a fundamental human gift to tell stories, and it's still the most powerful way to reach people. It has always been. I think if we were sitting around a fire circle 20,000 years ago somewhere on this planet, people would be telling stories. And not just a story of what they saw that day, but what they care about. It's a very human activity, and it still is. So think about how you want to use it. It's immensely powerful.
So to remind everyone, the lecture number 5 Q&A is the one to put questions in. I have a number here still, but here's about that polarizing issue, Tom. How do we bring climate crisis and environmental education into our curriculums when the climate crisis has been such a polarizing topic? And we still fail to implicate important and necessary topics such as critical race theory and gender into our elementary, middle, and high school education. How then do we get climate crisis in schools?
As I said, I think the way you do it is through every single subject area, because when you do that, you already are working in a structure that's much easier to change from within than it is to push something into the system. Now, I'm not saying to stop doing that, because we need all of that discussion to be happening at every level, not just elementary and preschool, but every level. But I think if you say, okay, history is the subject, how do we talk about history? Is it just the story of white males who are no longer around, or is it the story of just countries that were dominant and colonial, or is it more than that? How do we tell that story? What is history and herstory? How do we do that? I think that's the way to do it, is take existing subjects. The same is true, believe it or not, with mathematics, with any subject, statistics, things that you wouldn't think naturally fit this. Think about it. You can use mathematics to convey the complexities of the Earth's atmosphere and show what's really happening because of the greenhouse effect and gases like methane that are emitted that magnify that heating effect on our planet, which also tends to destabilize all other weather systems. And that's why California has giant rivers of rain coming in now and then, just like you just had. I feel like every subject there is has to also be about the environment.
That's a great point. Someone's curious, is the young Merlin a reflection of you, Tom?
Well, young Merlin is not quite as stupid as I am, but he has a lot to learn. and I do feel like, yes, I do identify in a big way with young Merlin, because in particular, his greatest healer and teacher and inspiration is Mother Nature. And that's consistent through all of the stories I tell about him, but it's not just me. I'm only the latest person in this huge long line of people this chorus of singers to sing songs about Merlin. I really do feel a closeness to him. And that's the core of it, is that when I've been and at times of real difficulty in my life, and we all have been, it's going out in nature is the one place where I feel like nature can hold it all. And I can bare my heart, my soul in nature and feel nurtured and supported and maybe even renewed. And I often have been. Just like Merlin, just like Kate, just like any of my other characters, but in particular Merlin, he's done that for 1,500 years in stories, and I'm just the latest person to continue that.
So you've talked a lot about storytelling, and someone very succinctly asked this question. Does T.A. Barron have a favorite story?
Yes. My favorite story is the one that you will tell with your life. It's true. I really have to emphasize that, Ken, because we live in an era, and I'm just talking very plain and frank with all of you, because I can tell with these questions, you really care. And you're aware of the struggles and difficulties of the planet and all people and creatures right now. Just remember this, that ultimately you do have power in the world. No matter how difficult the problems, you do. And the most effective way to use that power is in the life you lead, the choices you make, the decisions you make, or by the way, don't make, because if you don't make a decision, that is making a choice. But in whatever ways you choose to live that life, make it a story that you feel really feels true to you. That's my favorite story.
That's a great answer. I didn't put anyone up to this, but you have to get this next question. If you, Tom, were to turn these books, the Merlin books, into a film, what would you change or emphasize more and why? Have you ever thought about that, Tom?
Well, funny thing, you should ask about that. That's why I'm in California this week. I have been working on making the young Merlin saga into a film, and there's a great team of people now together working on that. And if you want to learn more about that, just go to my website, tabarron.com, click on Merlin the Movie, and there'll be some major update pretty soon on that front. So I think I also want to say that movies are a hugely powerful form of storytelling, and that's why I'm involved with it. There are going to be ways that my stories have to be changed. This first movie, which I hope will be the first of several, is based on my books 1 and 2 in the Merlin saga. And so there automatically are changes. There's also some other changes. We'll probably need to age up Merlin a little bit to make it really work. And we'll also need to raise up some of the other characters, and I'm very excited about that. And I've actually been doing a lot of work helping the team that's doing that, and we have a marvelous, fabulous group of people, director and producer and script writers. So it's been really exciting. Are we about to wrap up? I hear it a lot.
We are.
May I just say one last time, I have loved talking with you. You folks are terrific. And just please, wherever you go, whatever you do, remember, see your life as a story. Make it a great one. Thanks.
Wow, from that ovation, I think we're going to have to bring more people actually into class. This is terrific. So, okay, make sure you use your iClicker before you leave. Thanks so much, and have a great weekend. See you on Monday. Tom, that was terrific. That was really terrific. You make it so easy.